But the world of meaning has to be fundamentally this kind of hazy, unknowable space. If
Yeah.
we knew it, it would be the same thing as the literal world. The future for us becomes a meaningful plane because we can never reach the future. But that doesn't have to be the only plane of meaning. The different plane of meaning, something that I might say is the ineffable or the eternal, mystery more generally. We enter into, let's say, a flow state. And that kind of has this feeling of like almost connecting the different planes of existence all into one moment. But there's always a feeling of presentness, and the feeling of life being meaningful always centers this like experience of being fully in the present. Everybody will tell you that, like no matter what spiritual tradition you're a part of.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. Many of us, I myself, are addicted to shortcuts, to loopholes, to hacks, to workarounds. And I mean this pretty broadly, pretty across the board when it comes to practical matters, to intellectual pursuits, even spiritual, mystical ones, for lack of a better term. But what I've ultimately found is that kind of a disposition that's always looking for a workaround actually prevents meaningful growth, not only intellectually and on a personal level, but it actually cuts us off from a felt sense of the mystery. Because it's really only through profound slowing down, sinking in, taking the leap into the real deep waters that the mystery actually reveals itself. What Carl Jung called the spirit of the depths and the soul actually reveal themselves. So I'm always looking for people who are really doing the deep dive, both intellectually and experientially. But as you may have noticed, there's a lot of flimsy, shallow, woo-dipped, noisy personas out there claiming to have the goods, but ultimately are just substanceless, to put it kindly. The real depth dwellers, they are out there, but they are rare gems. Even rarer are the beings that channel their wisdom into an elixir that can be consumed by others. Rarer still are those that are like a decade younger than me. I actually don't even want to know the true age difference between myself and our guest in this one, Sarah Mergen, because that is precisely what she is, all of the above. She's clearly done some of the deepest spelunking into the work of Carl Jung of anyone I know, but not just Jung. She's intensely well read on philosophy and psychology and the esoteric in general. And she's imbuing her knowledge into an incredibly well put together podcast, her Katabasis Anabasis series, which is a comprehensive, I guess I would call it, psycho-spiritual, mythopoetic recontextualization of depression. She also constructs the highest of brow esoteric memes on Instagram at Carl Jung Memes. She's also a gifted riffer. Speaking of which, we muse about so much in this one. Carl Jung's mysticism, the importance of going beyond theory and getting to direct experience of the ineffable, of the mystery, how modern psychology and therapy often falls short, and so much more. All the links that you're going to need for Sarah Mergen are in the description. Same for Third Eye Drops. On that note, do look up Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to pods, as we've got hundreds of mind melds with truly brilliant beings. And would you like to go deeper, my friend? Would you like to join a community, get in on a book club, monthly Zoom hangs, get physical rewards, enter a patron-only Discord server, then join the Wonder Lodge, initiate yourself over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. I would love to riff with you there. But for now, let's meld minds with the brilliant Sarah Mergen. So good to finally have you in the mind meld. I've been so impressed with the depth and the quality of your work. Like, it's almost kind of funny to learn about someone through a meme page and then find that that's just like this weird billboard for this extremely deep diving portal into Jung, and this, not even just Jung, but this very like mythopoetic worldview that really takes inner life and the psyche and, to me, what I would call the spiritual realm very seriously. So happy to stumble across your work. So happy to have you in the pod.
Thank
I'm just
you.
excited to see where we go with this.
Very excited as well.
One of the things I love too is that you use one of my favorite Greek words in, I guess it's the title. Is Katabasis Anabasis the title of your show, or is it okay?
Yeah,
Yeah,
well, it's the title of the depression series specifically. Yeah.
gotcha. Okay. Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't listened to as much of your stuff as I would like to. I'll definitely dive deeper in the future. But yeah, this idea of catabasis in general
Mhm.
in the ancient world is a really, really interesting one. And I know we said we are going to get into some like kind of 101 Jung stuff first, but now that we're going in this direction, I want to follow this thread because this idea of catabasis, which generally means like going down or
Mhm.
going into the underworld to have
Mhm.
some kind of mystical experience. This is not only like a lost idea now, this is I think, an idea that the modern mind bristles at. You know,
Oh,
why would I
totally.
want to go down? Why would I want to go into the darkness? Why would I want to go into the underworld? Um, yeah. So with that, why do you think that's important? And what do you think we lose by disconnecting from those dark depths?
Well, I mean, the first thing that I would say, and this is kind of like the basis of my model, is that we are already there.
Yeah.
We are already kind of to some extent in hell. So, like, being able to take that journey on willingly and to recognize what it is really important. The other thing I really love about that word, it's a word I've actually known about since I was like in high school. I think it used to be the name of my Tumblr, when I
Oh,
was
nice,
14 or
nice.
something like that. But it does reframe the experience of kind of going into the depths, and especially like, I don't know, the series is about depression, right? But when we consider the full experiential tapestry of what depression actually is, you start to very quickly realize that that word doesn't cover everything. The word depression is just really a cluster of symptoms that are used for like a clinician to maybe correctly diagnose you. But depression can mean anhedonia, that's like a loss
Hmm.
of the ability to perceive or have pleasure. It can refer to kind of a more general suffering. It can, be weight gain, weight loss, changes in appetite in either direction. There's so much that gets lumped into the category of depression. And so I kind of prefer the word catabasis or, the descent into hell, like the dark night of the soul, because there's a world and a way in which having something like depression viewed from the medical gaze is very, very helpful and very, very necessary for people to get treatment. But if you want to take the experience as a whole and encounter it as a whole, I think that we do need a different vocabulary for it. And so that was kind of the other thing is that I'm not a therapist, I'm not a clinician. I don't have that kind of credential or licensing. And so a lot of the work that I do is approaching depression or catabasis from sort of a philosophical, mythopoetic perspective, and I want to make that clear because I don't want to be giving advice to people who are looking, like to me for medical
Right.
advice. This is just an exploration of the experience itself.
Yeah. Yeah, that totally makes sense. And there's this other sort of throbbing element of that whole line of inquiry that is, this isn't just, the archetypal dark night of the soul, like this rite of passage that we all sort of have to go through to some
Mhm.
extent. It's something that people willingly did and was actually deeply connected to healing and
Yes.
to communing with the other world and to gods and um, oracular insight and inspiration. And this idea that going down into the darkness can somehow be healing as well as uncomfortable. Like, I'm not saying I've achieved this, but I've definitely knowingly gone into a lot of experiences that were scary and dark. I mean, pretty much any, sufficiently strong psychedelic experience is always going to have, for me at least, this very deep, like, chthonic element, sort
Hmm.
of not just reminders of your mortality, but in almost like rubbing your nose in the mess that you are, and like, and the brevity and tragicness of life. And that is scary, and it is dark, and it is terrifying, but at the same time, the shadow of all of that is what it's light, it's inspiration, it's wisdom,
Yeah.
it's insight. Did I say insight already? Into you know all of these things that you're searching for are on the other side of this dark membrane. And I think this is going to get into so many of the things that we're going to riff about today, like this book Catafalque, and
Hmm.
um, really Jung's method in general, is that we do so many things both consciously and unconsciously to protect us from that dark membrane between being alive, being happy, being healthy, being in the light, being successful, and what's looming,
Yes.
that which why would you willingly go in there? Why would you want to look into these dark depths and go have a cat is catabol I don't even know if catabolic's the right word. But
It can
catab
be.
catabasising. Why would you want to go a catabasising? Why not just push it off as long as possible, Sarah?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. One of the things that I think about a lot, there's a book that has really influenced me by Ernesto de Martino called The World of Magic. And he basically talks about how in sort of shamanic or, cultures that would utilize shamanism or he calls them magic cultures, um, there was kind of this like primary drama. And in his view, and I don't know whether this is right or not, but I think it's just a very interesting way of approaching the problem. The primary drama of these worlds was the drama of presence. And so, largely speaking, you have kind of maybe more of a mentality that is connected to the environment, sort of this, like, I guess you would say the participation mystique if you're
Oh
Jungian, let's
yeah,
say.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that the job of the shaman was to go and to retrieve presence for both themselves or an individual or for the community at large. And presence here would be defined as something like existing within a coherent structure of a universe where things kind of like are solidly what they are. There's like a difference between the object and the subject type of situation. Um, and that mentality is something that we can't really conceive of from our modern perspective. We've actually lost that sort of state of consciousness. Now, whether he's right or wrong about that, you could kind of argue either way. What it brings to mind for me is the idea that our civilization and our society also has a primary drama. And to me, that is the drama of meaning and significance. Every single cultural institution, in the same way that a shaman really is a cultural institution to maintain presence, for us, our cultural institutions are largely there to help us feel like we are significant actors in a meaningful universe and to kind of almost maintain that. I don't want to call it an illusion because it's not an illusion, but to keep that sort of self concept functioning, because without that, we're lost and we get depressed. With that said, I think the value of depression, or one possible value, is that we are forced to confront sort of these, the way that meaning and significance are handed to us.
Hmm.
And largely they are handed to us in sort of this like goal oriented, future oriented manner. One of the things I talk about on my podcast a lot is the idea that we are kind of spoon fed this relationship to reality where the only thing that is real is like the objective external world. And then you have kind of this illusion of a subjective conscious experience, but that's not nearly as real as the world
Right.
around us. And so your only kind of method for maintaining significance and meaning is to kind of participate in this goal directed behavior, to go out and get the job, become famous, get money, whatever it is, start a family. Depression Jung would say this as well, is a little bit of a breakdown and adaptation. I think that's actually the word that he uses, or the
Hmm.
phrase that
Hmm.
he uses. And when you do have this breakdown in adaptation, this all of a sudden you are disconnected from the meaning structure that our world kind of gives to us. You know, you lose your job, you lose your significant other, you maybe just like find yourself suddenly depressed and you don't even know why. um you start to question, like, where is meaning coming from? And so my model, or at least like what I am interested in, is basically, are there ways of finding meaning and significance that exist outside of the future, where we no longer have to rely on goal directed behavior to give ourselves a sense of significance and purpose? And I think that's where Jung comes in. He's very helpful in that. Sorry, this is a very long explanation,
No,
but
no,
depression gives us an opportunity to ask ourselves those questions and to really dig into it. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of people out there who can help people through this process. It's largely pathologized. And so the value in it can kind of get lost.
for sure. Yeah, this way that modern life coerces us into behaving as if, it's infected the psyche, the modern psyche so deeply
Yeah.
that the way that most people talk about spirituality is only as far as it will extend to their own ego, in things
Yes.
like manifestation, for instance. Um, and yeah, this point that you made where it's like, what meaning do you have? What is the ground level meaning that you have as a being when life necessitates a loss for you? Like,
Hmm.
or just circumstances, or all those examples you gave, loss of a relationship, loss of a job, whatever kind of failure. If the ego loses a crown jewel in its um crown, what when we don't have a deeper sense of meaning, it feels like the world is inflicting some kind of r- actual malice on us as a being, right? Like, it
Yes.
feels like, why is the world out to get me? Why is the world doing this to me? But when you view yourself as more than that, and not just view yourself as more than that, but you actually start to develop a deeper relationship with the psyche beyond that level of self, it recontextualizes the ego and what it is and where it sits in this sort of hierarchy of being.
Yeah.
And I don't think that it's ever a comfortable process in terms of getting to this place where you really feel the ego being somehow, ancillary to these deeper parts of the self. But I do think it's very real when you develop. I'm not I'm not trying to say this in a way where I feel like I've done what I'm describing,
Uh-huh.
but I do know the difference between what it feels like when you fail into nothing versus when you fail, like, that's what we were talking about with creative endeavors and the way that you spend your time.
Yeah.
Like, when you're doing something, like, let's say for a job, let's kind of turn this inside out. If you're doing something, let's say for a job that you hate,
Hmm.
and then it fails, it just feels like this giant wall of shit, because it's like, I don't want to be doing this job, and now I'm doing a bad job at doing this job, and it's just like a sandwich with extra shit on top.
Yeah.
And but if you fail towards something that you truly care about down to the deepest fiber of your being, it still sort of feels like you're doing something right. I think
Hmm.
I think that's the qualitative shift that occurs. That if you're operating in this way that is just egoic, just for the service of the ego and for goals like you were talking about, versus operating from this deeper place. And there's a really I'm just remembering this now. There's a really almost like straightforward way of saying this too that I could have said in about 5 seconds. It's the concept of, have you heard of intrinsic motivators versus extrinsic
Yeah.
motivators?
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
it's like, I think it comes from positive psychology, or maybe it's just um like a more I don't know, academic behavior based psychology in general. And essentially it's exactly what it sounds like. It's if the sense of subjective goodness is
Mhm.
wrapped up in what you're doing, you don't need the external congratulations or goal or trophy or money or whatever it is. Like you'll do the thing for the sake of how it makes you feel. And then when you reflect on the fact that we almost purposefully withhold positive feelings from ourselves
Mhm.
unless we feel like we deserve it, that adds a whole extra layer. It's like I'm not allowed to feel good yet until I clear X arbitrary bar or something. And that it does not need to be that way. It absolutely does not need to be that way. And it says a lot that the world has become so fucked up that we withhold those things from ourselves willingly, almost in a strange way.
Yeah, no, totally. Well, I mean, what you're speaking to is something that I kind of have been addressing actually in the most recent episode that I'm working on. Just for context, I'm at sort of like the penultimate stage episode of my like model of depression. And I call this stage the collapse of the tower because
Mm,
the tower really, for me, symbolically represents our value structures. And the thing about value structures, and this comes from two theorists I absolutely love. They have a book called Hanging On and Letting Go that is completely inaccessible and just also like it's really expensive. And it's a beautiful theory of depression that just got lost
mm,
because it wasn't kind of like in company with the sort of behaviorist uh, ethos of the time that it was published. But the idea between or behind this is that your value structure is something that's sort of handed to you by culture, and this is something that allows us to maintain self-esteem. And self-esteem is kind of a weird concept because we think of that word as being a little bit like, oh, that's just whether you feel good about yourself or not. The way that they talk about it is that it's more a sense of feeling safe within yourself.
mm.
And really, if we were to put that into Jungian terminology, it's the idea that your ego feels non threatened.
Right.
But again, this isn't just like whether I feel good about myself. It's sort of like, am I a safe place to be? Is my understanding
Ooh.
of the world correct? Do I have a good idea of what the rules of the game are? That's probably the best way I could put it. And so like these sort of external motivators are really playing into this idea of what the game is and how to play it. And if we break the rules or if we fail, then we get thrown or thrust into a sense of lacking self safety. But the point that I would make is that all of that external stuff, it's about safety. It's just about, am I doing well? And if
Right.
I'm doing well, then I can know that I'm going to continue doing well in the future. With that said, when you have kind of this like internally generated motivation towards things, I mean, that can be tied to external stuff as well and just be so deeply internalized that you
Mhm.
feel like it's coming up from yourself, but it's really just something you learned like at age 3. But that stuff can also be leading us toward one of the greater values, I think, in the human psyche, which is, um, I guess you could say, connection, deep experience, meaning, as I would define it. And, in a number of the episodes I've done, I take really good care to define meaning. Meaning to me is that which the literal is gesturing towards. So it's that which exists beyond the literal.
Mm.
So, for instance, if you're watching a movie or something like that, there's the literal world of the movie. And then there's kind of like the directing choice of, oh, this particular scene is red tinted and that means this. But the world of meaning has to be fundamentally this kind of hazy, unknowable space. If
Yeah.
we knew it, it would be the same thing as the literal world. And so, um, kind of going back to something I mentioned earlier about future and goal oriented things, the future for us becomes a meaningful plane because we can never reach the future. we can never access it. And so we look to the things in the present to get like sort of like a mental picture of what the future is going to look like for us. But that doesn't have to be the only plane of meaning.
Right.
So when we are in a state of doing something that is like internally motivated, often when it's really powerful, when it's really motivating, I think it's not just that it's gesturing towards something in the future that we would like to have happen, but often it's in conversation with a different plane of meaning, something that I might say is the ineffable or the
Hmm.
eternal or mystery more generally.
Yeah.
I think that when we really are connected to something that we deeply enjoy, we enter into, let's say, a flow state. And
Hmm.
that kind of has this feeling of like almost connecting the different planes of existence all into one moment. But there's always a feeling of presentness, I think, is what's really interesting, is that meaning and the feeling of life being meaningful always centers this like experience of being fully in the present. And like everybody will tell you that, like no matter what
Yeah.
spiritual tradition you're a part of, that is kind of a phenomenological necessity to that. So anything that connects you to that is good.
So well said. Yeah, so well said. It reminds me of another one of my favorite Greek words that I was actually just reading a bit about the other day. Um, and it's the word anagage. You maybe a word you're
Mm.
familiar with. The way I typically think of it is the way John Vervaeke uses it.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if you've ever checked out any of his stuff, but he's a
I've been
um,
meaning to.
yeah, he's great. He's a cognitive science professor at University of Toronto, but he has this series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis and another series called After Socrates that is sort of like this exhaustive um multidisciplinary approach to the modern meaning crisis that goes, through everything from developing a meditative practice to understanding ancient Greek philosophy so that you sort of can root yourself in this sort of basic grammar of logic and meaning making
Yeah.
to modern participatory cognitive science. But he uses anagoge sort of in the context of developing, I guess, what I would call a mature spiritual and wisdom seeking disposition that understands that it's a forever open ended upward ascent that you will
Mhm.
not reach the end of. So that's the way I typically think about it. But if you look the word up, one of the first things you'll find is that it's like this hermeneutic when you're reading that goes beyond metaphorical and it goes beyond allegorical, and it's like an allusion to something transcendent and beyond what's written
Yep.
on the paper or even can be said. And I guess like I'm trying to think of what a good example of this might be, but maybe something like the Tao Te Ching, right? Where it's just it's almost through like a negative, what you could almost call like negative theology. Like the Tao is not this, the Tao. Platonists do it all the time with the one. Like the one is not this, the one is not that. Um, and through that, you almost get some level of shadow understanding or something through
Yeah.
understanding that you don't understand it. Um, yeah, a lot of what you were saying reminded me of that, and I think the ineffable and this idea of doing this like anagogic hermeneutic or something um, is really important. Why do you think that's so important? This idea of gesturing toward the thing that you can never reach. Why is that important, and how does that help with depression, do you think?
Oh boy. I mean, there's a million different ways to answer that. But this is like actually really the crux of my work. I think, oh man, I mean, I guess the first connection I would draw is toward Jung, because a lot of what I do and like the feedback I've gotten about my treatment of him is that I think like I actually had somebody comment, like so much of the way that you talk about Jung makes him seem obvious, but not in a bad way. And I was like, yeah, well that is largely what I try to do, is that I think, with Jung specifically, just as an example, it's very easy to get caught in these kind of concepts, and like you have like a mental image of like what an archetype is, what the shadow is. It's really easy to conceive of the shadow as being this creepy crawly thing
Yeah.
in your psyche. And it's like, no, I mean, yes, maybe like the images are very, very important, but I'm interested in a way that we can bring some of these concepts into an immediate experience of them, and like an obvious experience. But when I say obvious, that's not to demystify it, right? It's kind of more like, what world can I enter where these things are obvious? And so a lot of my model around depression does center around this idea of the dream view of reality. That's just kind of my term. It's a view of reality that I largely borrowed from sort of a combination of Peter Kingsley and Catafalque, which we were talking about earlier.
Hmm.
And then another philosopher I just admire so much, Federico Campagna, who wrote Technic and Magic, and another book called Prophetic Culture. And between these two, you kind of get this view of reality that I don't know. It feels like a very mystical relationship to reality, but it's very difficult to articulate to people, because in order for somebody else to kind of get what I'm saying, I often have to say it's like, well, it's like you're looking at everything around you as though you're looking at like a uh not an illusion, but what was the dress? You know, the black and gold, or the black and
Oh
blue and white and
yeah.
gold dress, the optical illusion.
Yeah, an
Thank you.
optical
Sorry.
illusion, right? Yeah.
Reality is very much like an optical illusion, and there is kind of like a crease in it or a moment that once you realize that you're not fully getting it, just the whole image flips, but it's a perceptual experience. And so I think with regard to these kind of like non-obvious things versus obvious things, or the idea that you would have to gesture towards something, it's a way of you getting, or it's a way of getting you out of your head so that you can actually have a change in perception,
Hmm.
which really just leads to the obvious as revelation, right? Um, so my kind of experience or idea of depression is that so much of what the cure is, or what is going to help people, is just changing their relationship with reality. But in order for you to get them to do that, you kind of have to start breaking down um, your understanding of what reality is. And in order to do that, you have to kind of be like, well, it's not this. I'm not talking about that. I'm not saying this. It's, and I will allow you to find it on your own.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think that's really important because I think one of the things that gets lost in Jung's very loquacious, prolific way of writing is what you actually do, right?
yeah.
I find myself, there's a lot of writers and thinkers like this that I absolutely love, where I get enamored and almost like a kind of high while I'm reading it or listening to them or playing with the ideas, but I'm left with a sense of what do I do now? And I've thought a lot about that in my own like videos and ramblings that I've done on Jungian topics. Is how do you take, because they become these almost memes,
Yes.
and I realize that it sounds shallow, and I kind of mean it to sound shallow, because it becomes this weird hood ornament of what it actually represents. And I think this is kind of what we were talking about, I think, before we were recording.
Hmm.
What has happened to a lot of Jung's concepts in general is that there's the popular idea of the thing with
Absolutely.
the definition and the grammar of how it's supposed to go, like this, then like this, then like that you lose access to the raw experience of whatever it is. But actually getting to the raw experience of what it is, it's not a simple formula.
Hmm.
So do you actually address in your series, do you actually address specific ways to go into the underworld, or to go into the realm of psyche, or to work with the realm of psyche, or do you mostly stick with the sort of mythopoetic reframing, and shift in disposition?
I mean, I try. I give it my best. In the first couple episodes, I do address kind of, as I was saying, like I have sort of the dream view of reality, which I sort of contrast to what I've been calling the materialist view of reality. Federico Campagna would call it the technic.
Mm.
Um, but largely, I just kind of try to draw people into that perceptive space with analogies and kind of little riddles from time to time. One of the things that I start the series on is there are two phrases, and I'm like, if you can get these phrases, if you can understand deep within your bones what I'm saying here, then you got it. And if these seem completely irrational to you or confusing, then you're not quite there yet. And so that's kind of what I meant with the optical illusion thing, is that sometimes you just have to like point to the part of the picture that doesn't quite make sense. But the two phrases I use are everything is real and depression is a place. And
Mm.
if you can get to a place where that makes sense to you, then you will kind of have entered into a different relationship with reality. But the one that really trips people up is this idea of everything is real.
I was just going to
And
ask about that. Yeah.
yeah, it's very, very difficult. A lot of it has to do, like if I had to explain that one a little bit deeper, it would be that we have been trained largely to regard our conscious subjective experience as somehow less real than the world around us. And so, if you asked the average person, what's more real, a dream you had last night or an apple that you hold in your hand, they're going to say the apple is more real, right? Um, and for me, it's a bit of a reframe. It's to say, okay, well, actually, consciousness does exist. It's here, it's present, it's just as real as any material object around you. um why would we regard a dream as less real? It's like, okay, well, it doesn't correspond to truthful objective reality, but the fact that you had that dream and that you experienced it the way that you did is real. That is that
Right.
there's nothing not real about that. And this is just kind of an idea that the more you sit with it, and often, you know I'll just sit in a room and focus on my immediate perception of the room, of, like if I feel sunlight on my hand, all of the weird, ineffable, sort of not just subjective, but indescribable components that come with sunlight on my hand, the associations, even if I can't put that into words, it's just as real as the fact that I know that this thing is called the sun. So it's really tapping into, there's that phrase about like don't confuse the map for the territory.
Hmm. Hmm.
Largely what I try to get people to do is to tap into the felt sense and experiential reality of the territory itself. It's one thing to know that the map isn't the territory, it's another to fully go into the sensation around you and understand the reality that's within that sensation. So just that reframe, I think, can be helpful for some people. The other thing is like depression as a place. Often if you sort of conceive of depression, we think of that as being something that happens in our heads. It's like a series of emotions and thoughts that are negative. Or it's like a chemical imbalance in our brains or whatever. But when you start to think about your depression as something that is embedded in your perception of the world,
Yeah.
but then you also start to consider your perception of the world as being really one of the foundational pillars of what the world is. If you can make those two leaps and you can start to realize that your experience of depression, it's not just something that's going on in your head, it's on the face of your loved ones. It's literally in the phone, in the phone in the palm of your hand. Just that switch and kind of like how you are thinking about the problem can lead to a lot of insights. But in terms of actual practices to get there, it's kind of difficult. I mean, for me, I just read Catafalque and I was like, there.
Mm.
I immediately, it just switched everything for me. And that is why I like that book a lot. But it doesn't do that for everybody.
So I know what you mean about this sort of mind altering effect of reading Catafalque. And it's weird. I get this with certain writers really bring me there, like reading The Dream in the Underworld by Hillman, that really kind of
Hmm.
brought me there too, if you've read that. But I mean, other mystical texts too, like reading, like the Poimandres or something, like the Hermetic text, like will get me deep into those um sorts of spaces. And what I think it is that it's really asking you to put yourself in the reality of, I think in all of these cases, shifting your like turning your perception of reality inside out, so that somehow the mind is usurping the physical world, and that the mind is
Yes.
what's more real than the physical world. And when you go there, it doesn't make any kind of logical sense necessarily, but it makes a kind of subjective, mind altering sense where you like almost feel like you just microdosed or something. Like that's really how I feel. Like I'll sometimes have to stop and be like, "Whoa, this is I'm loving this." It's hard to put into words, but again, this sort of eventually makes me arrive at this place where I feel it, but I'm not sure what to do with it afterward. But I think
Hmm.
what happens over time is it has this compounding effect where that does start to become closer to your default way of seeing reality and feeling reality, where the physical world is still, not saying that it's not real, but that the mind is not contingent on the physical. It's more that the physical is contingent on some sort of faculty of consciousness or mind. Has this line of thinking gotten you to a place of panpsychism or idealism, or do you think they exist in a kind of entangled isness where both sides are of some equal ontological value?
I I have no idea. I mean, I think that for me, my interest in it is so experiential and so like grounded in kind of phenomenology that I almost
Yeah.
don't really care. It sounds really bad, but I think that the first time I really started to experience things that way, and could just be sitting in a room and being like, wow, like the inside is the outside is in the inside, and I know that, this isn't just a thought that I'm having, but this is like a direct experience of reality. There was a part of me that was like, oh, like I want to extrapolate, like
Yeah.
philosophical, blah blah blah. But at the end of the day, I was kind of like, I almost don't want to put this into words because I am afraid that if I try to contextualize it too much, it might become less accessible in the future. And maybe that's just sort of superstitious on my part. But I know that like in a lot of spiritual teachings, like in a lot of sort of mystical approaches, that there is often a very large danger in kind of um, having one of these experiences and then not being able to access it again. And that often that can then like it can come from being too attached to a particular way of viewing what the experience was,
Mm.
so to speak.
Yeah.
Um, but that's just me. Like I think that it would be very worthwhile for somebody to like try and codify it or try to like figure out what school it fits into or whatever. I just like to sit and experience what is immediately like there for me.
Is reading one of the primary pathways for you to hit that space, or do you have other practices that get you there?
I think initially for me, it was like reading Kingsley and
Mm.
Campagna back to back alongside the Red Book. Like, I
Yeah,
mean, I've
yeah.
read the Red Book before, but it was just sort of like this trio of okay, everybody is sort of orbiting around this central idea, and what is that idea, and then that kind of led me there. Since then, if I really want to go back and access it, I will just read Peter Kingsley a little bit because he seems to work for me. But largely speaking, it's kind of like a knowing that cannot be unknown,
Mm.
is what I would say. And so even when I can't quite get there, I still know what it's like. And I don't really fret about getting to that place. But one thing that I will also say is that Peter Kingsley has this kind of series of talks that he gave a while ago talking about incubation
Yeah.
and the practice of incubation as a meditative. We talked a little bit about that. He has a very specific view of what incubation is, and that is largely a moving down into sensation and the sensation within the body, but then also moving back out into the sensation around you. And his kind of idea is that if you can maintain perfect awareness of the sensation within your body and perfect awareness of the sensation of what's going on around you, you become, I think his literal way of explaining it is that you become a little bit like the tree of life, that the body literally is the underworld in a
Hmm.
lot of ways, and that what's around you is kind of the above world. And so if you can kind of maintain that access, you can stay in this space that he's describing. I've tried that a little bit. I do find it very helpful, but it's really hard to, I mean, I think he talks about it in one series of talks that's like $90 to get the full series.
Right,
So it's
right.
not, it's very esoteric, difficult to access kind of information, which is sad because I think people would find it very helpful if they could.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, incubation is such an interesting topic in general, and just to sort of give the 10,000-foot view of what
Yeah.
this is, what it means, where it comes from. It's a it comes from a Greek word like something like I think it's incubatio, which means something like to sleep within.
Hmm.
And I can see why he's equating that with this subjectively turning inward practice that is sensation based and is, this almost maybe a more primordial way of experiencing the self and the world that we've lost ready access to because we do have these frontal lobes and all these concepts and language, and it's like that is the backdrop at all times, but
Yeah.
we're just so front facing and ocular that we've just lost our access to that. But for the ancient Greeks, it literally also was going to specific sacred places and sleeping within those places. So, like,
Yes.
you go to the temple of Asclepius, you go into the special chamber, you incubate there. For people that don't know, Asclepius was essentially the god of medicine. And if you go sleep in his chamber, you could have a healing dream where Asclepius would actually come and heal you. And there are several of these places. There's like, the cult of Tryphonius. There are these like heroic cults. One I can't. Tryphonius actually might be one of them. One of those like Greek hero demigod types. But but yeah, so you literally would do this practice of going into probably darkness, into these weird chambers and sleeping there and having some kind of revelation or healing or kind of oracular insight. Um, but I also think of it more, I think, in the way that he's talking about, though I would have to hear his spiel on it a little more because I
Yeah.
think generally, like if you look to somebody who's more directly a mystic like Plotinus, he specifically prescribes the importance of regular disconnection from the outside world and turning inward. And it sounds really esoteric, I think, to the modern mind, but I also think that if you can commit to putting yourself in those experiences of sensory deprivation, that world reveals itself without you having to really do much other than just stay there. And it's going to start with this, it's going to start with a lot of incessant thoughts. It kind of feels like moving through. I mean, if anybody's done 10 minutes of mindfulness meditation, you've probably experienced this where there's all these thoughts and all these things and all these narratives. And then those slowly start to slow down. And then you slowly start to get in this calm. For me, it turns up as this almost like wavy kind of mind's eye thing. And then getting to the deeper levels beyond that usually requires either a lot of time or like a molecular wheel greasing with like something psychedelic or something like that.
Right.
Um, but it's definitely there, and it's definitely the strangest, most familiar place you can go. It's like simultaneously the strangest, most familiar place because it feels like the flowing stream of not formed dreams necessarily, but like the potential for what could be a dream or something. And sometimes that's scary. Sometimes that's like almost a raw archetype encounter. Sometimes it's, yeah, it's very trickstery in general. It feels like a very trickstery place where one thing, like something can show up in one way and then suddenly turn into the opposite of the thing that it just was. And um, I mean, even ridiculously cartoony to a point where you almost can't believe that it's happening. Like it's almost like literal Looney Tunes in front of your mind's eye type stuff that can happen. And
Yeah.
that's a real place, quote unquote, that is always there that we have on mute, like right now as we're talking, like that flow of images, of symbols, of who knows what is there right now. And it always is. And it's, we can convince ourselves that it doesn't exist, but it's literally always been with you. You're in it right now. That's one of the things that Hillman talks about in Dream in the Underworld too, is like the underworld is here now. You're actually in
Hmm.
the underworld right now. And that's a mind altering thought to really play with in and of itself.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that that is kind of like the connective point between Kingsley and then obviously Jung and like Hillman, just a lot of the different thinkers that I so deeply enjoy. I mean, even are you familiar with Ian McGilchrist?
A bit.
Uh
Yeah, I need to read more of him though.
okay. Well, this is a mass oversimplification, but I think that it is kind of roughly okay to say that what he describes is kind of like the perspective of the right hemisphere as being
Yeah.
pretty much Jung's unconscious. Like it's very similar in enough ways that I'm like, okay, well, we can at least draw some parallels here. But I think what's fascinating about that sort of connection is the idea that like we have become so over identified with what might be considered our left hemisphere, with the dopamine focused mind, with kind of this perspective in Western culture that really does prefer to see everything around us from the perspective of instrumentality, right? And so, going back to kind of like how people talk about Jung and what they try to get out of him and individuation, there's a grasping, a sense of like, oh, I want to use this as a tool. I want to get it right. I want to go through the stages. I want
Hmm. Hmm.
here. And that's at complete odds with, or at least kind of like this shiny veneer over what we might call the right hemisphere perspective. We could also call that the unconscious. We could we call it the underworld. Um, I think it's a approach towards life and reality that we all intuitively know, and we can all access it if we can just relax this kind of like hyper conscious grasping mind and then sink down into this other place that is fueled by images. It's fueled by seeing the whole instead of the parts. One of the things that Ian McGilchrist talks about is that the right hemisphere approaches things as people as opposed to tools.
Mm.
And there's something very interesting about like the phenomenology of what it means to see something as a living other, as a
Yeah.
person, as opposed to a tool. And even if it is a tool, the right hemisphere tends to look at everything as being like intimately connected, kind of in this like mystical tradition that you could attach to a variety of different thinkers or approaches. But I think that that is also interesting to me, is that what you said specifically about the underworld is already here. Like we are already living in it. If you close your eyes long enough to see these images, they will come up, if you want them to, even if you don't want
Yeah.
them to, really.
No, yeah, yeah. No, I agree. And what's so strange about it is it can manifest in these really non-logical ways, like in just
Hmm.
subjective feelings, memories, sensations in the body. And I mean, again, this is like way easier to see like if you take a dose of something, but you can definitely get to these places on the natch 100%. Like
Yeah.
I did a pod recently with my friend Eric Godzi, who's one of the most, like, one of my friends that most regularly faces his fears in terms of altered states of consciousness, and he
Mm.
did an extended darkness, like legit, Katabasis type experience where he was in complete darkness for 5 days, I think.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, no light at all for 5 days, and the the trippiness of it is on the level of, and he's somebody who has had a lot of, again, psychedelic experiences, and he talks about it with the same level of intensity
Hmm.
of anything that he's ever experienced. So it's very real. It's very available if you're willing to put yourself in the situations where you can turn up the volume on it. Um, but then again, I think there's always this return to the firmament of practicality, right? When you are living in a world that does not comport with these experiences, and placing those experiences even on equal footing to what you're supposed to care about, what you're supposed to chase after. And I think that for me is probably the most existentially difficult hurdle to surmount. Is I've downloaded all these ideas. I've had all these experiences. Yes, I can talk to people on a podcast. Yes, I can riff. I can have these great conversations. But at the end of the day, the world is what it is, and the world does not seem to care about these things. And
Mm.
finding a way that you can coexist, square the circle of the inner and outer, personality one, personality two, spirit of the depths, spirit of the times, to use the Jungian terminology. That is that is the real alchemical transmutation. If you can somehow merge the, and that's one issue that I have taken with Kingsley as I've been reading Catafalque, is he seems to be really arguing for this notion that the inner is somehow superior and more important, like personality to spirit of the depths is
Mm.
what's more real, and the outer is what's more illusory. And there's some line in particular where he's kind of um railing against the scientific, overly logical, rational worldview. um and he's speaking, to the importance of the opposite, essentially. And in a sense, that almost seems very non-Jungian for a book that's supposed to be about Jung and his philosophy, where Jung's philosophy seems to be about making the unconscious conscious, making sense of things that don't reconcile, finding ways to reconcile them. And it seems almost like he's arguing for a kind of rejection
Hmm.
of one, and that I don't think 99% of people can live that way practically. So, um yeah, I don't know what the question is here, but I guess I'm introducing the problem of once again the persistent practicality problem, and how to bring these things back down to felt change in your life, and felt um meaning, like an increased sense of meaning making, because it can just be destabilizing, right? Like, I mean, how many,
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure people who've like gone on a retreat, or they're like, hey, I'm gonna go eat a bunch of mushrooms, and they come back and they're more confused than they were, before, for something that's supposed to help wake something up or bring insight. It can actually bring quite a lot of confusion, I think, as well.
People who go off and have kind of these psychedelic or sort of mystical experiences, and then get their world turned upside down, maybe not in a good way. And one thing that I talk about a lot kind of in my series and also just on my meme page, frankly, is that around the time I was 17, I took way too much LSD in a forest, and had, I guess, what you would call like an ego death experience. That doesn't even feel quite right to me. I think it felt more like a world death experience,
Wow.
where I didn't feel outside my body. I didn't really feel like my ego was disrupted. It felt like my relationship to the outside became absolutely estranged. And this particular experience, it was very traumatizing. It was not a good trip. And it led to about a 2-year experience with derealization. I'm not sure if you're
Wow.
familiar with derealization,
I,
depersonalization.
I have an idea, but feel free to define. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, the more common experience is depersonalization. That roughly feels like, I mean, I don't know, I've never experienced that specifically, but that you're kind of outside your body, that you've sort of lost your center as a person. You don't really feel like you yourself are real.
Yeah.
Derealization, like de-reality, right? It's
Hmm.
the world doesn't feel real. The world feels like this kind of strange shadow land. The way that I kept describing it is that it felt like everything that I perceived was sort of this almost like a projection from a projector on a
Wow.
blank canvas, and that I was terrified every moment that I was going to slip out of the illusion and onto the canvas itself, which was just going to be this like white, vast expanse of nothingness and meaninglessness. Um, Terrifying. I remember I was in college when this happened. We had a lecture on Plato's Cave,
Oh
and
yeah,
I
yeah.
had to leave the room. I was just
Wow.
like, I can't do this. This is too much for me. And so that experience is kind of, well, first of all, with regard to my own lore, that is where I realized that I had to take my mental health into my own hands, because at the time, my psychiatrist didn't know what derealization is. My therapist didn't know what it was. Nobody around me knew that word.
Wow.
And so I really had to go and figure it out for myself, which is terrifying because I would have like just way rather be depressed and anxious than derealized ever again. It was awful. But
Yeah.
what was interesting is that, at some point I found my way out of it. Largely that was through confronting my anxiety and my fear of touching this kind of ineffable aspect of reality.
Yeah.
And I actually tried to induce like a dissociative experience, and it was like through I was able to find my way out of it. I became less afraid of these moments where things didn't make sense. But
Interesting.
um,
How did
you
you
know,
do
it,
that?
oh, I literally went to the meditation center on campus. We have like a little meditation
Hmm.
building at my school, and it's open, into the evening. And I just sat there and like kind of meditated, but really I
Wow.
tried to lose my grasp of reality, because the thing that was so scary is that it felt like reality was going to um, evaporate, like it was just going to disappear, or I was going to lose touch. I was going to like go crazy. And so I tried to make it worse, and I realized I couldn't make it worse. And in doing that, I was like, okay, well, this is the worst it's going to get, so to speak. Like, there's nothing to be afraid of here.
Yeah.
But eventually it went away. And just the experiential knowledge that I could have such a different relationship with reality, I guess for me, sort of posited the idea that maybe there was something on the opposite side of derealization, something like a deeper realization
Right.
of reality. And I didn't really pursue that too much because I didn't know how. And then I found the work of Federico Campagna, who I guess, if you're interested in what to do with Peter Kingsley, I would recommend checking out Campagna, because he kind of approaches it from a more like staunchly philosophical, metaphysical perspective.
Cool.
And I loved what he had to say about kind of different approaches to reality, how our metaphysics informs what we literally experience and
Yeah.
perceive. And then I found out that Federico Campagna had had derealization earlier on in his life, and that
Hmm.
is what informed his entire philosophy. And I was just like, whoa, this is something that you kind of almost have to go through the depths of, to the question's point, like these very ungrounding experiences, these sort of chaotic, like bad shroom trip, overly mystical experiences, to get to the other side of what it means for those things to actually feel connected and integrated.
Yeah.
I'm curious. I don't know if that's true. I wouldn't suggest pushing yourself into like a really bad place like that, but
Well, in my experience, yeah, I've gone to, so I haven't had an experience exactly like what you're describing, but I've definitely had severe reality quaking experiences where it just
yeah.
feels like there is no up down, like I have no sense of, other than I feel like I'm being psychologically and physically tormented. I don't know anything other than just I'm in fractal chaos and I want it to end right now kind of feeling. Um but for me, I've talked about this ad nauseum, so I won't go in the long version of it. But I did a five day ayahuasca retreat a few years ago,
Oh,
and
wow.
it was so like the whole thing was incredibly difficult, underworld, just like s- s- there's a heavy physiological element to it too when you take a strong dose of ayahuasca. So it's not just mental turmoil, it's physical as well, like feeling like you're poisoned and then also feeling like you're just in a complete psychic shipwreck. Um, but there was a getting to the other side. Like there was a getting to the one and only experience I've ever had that was a very, very clear, like archetypal Senex type
Hmm.
of full blown wizard like manifestation in my mind's eye, being like hitting me with a kind of transcendent knowing that completely just like laid everything to rest. Just as, and it was something as simple as a felt sense of it seemed to be like a gesturing to the night sky and
Mm.
don't worry so much about this Michael game you're playing. Enjoy it, like live it the best way you can do. And then you see this, and it was sort of like a gesturing to just stars and beautiful sky. He's like, and then you'll do that game after you're done with the Michael game.
Oh,
And then
damn.
it was like anything else. It was sort of like that, and I was like, I don't know. Um, and then the duration for the rest of that experience was feeling like I had this razor sharp kind of imagine it, and it will show up in clear 4K, like bring it into just absolute reality in your mind kind of experience. And I don't have a strong visual imagination usually at all. Like if you said imagine this and this and that, I could not get a clear resolution image. But for the duration of that experience, it was this crazy, like I could make whole vivid realities in my mind for the next couple of hours. But it literally was like a journey through hell every night, and I got to that place once. So
Wow.
I do think there's a for sure getting to the other side, but it's
Hmm.
never guaranteed. It's kind of just like it's the reality of any kind of adventure, right? Like, why is it that every adventure I read, it's following the pattern of the hero's journey and all, like there's like the meeting of the friends, there's the threshold guardians, there's the dark night of the soul, there's the return with the elect, there's all these things. The problem is when you do them yourself, you don't always get the whole thing. You don't always get the whole full cycle. But when you do, it's like one of the best things you can possibly experience. And going as deep into the darkness as you can possibly go is one of the most important parts. So that when you come out and you get to this from utter chaos to utter transcendent sense, it's like the best thing ever. But it's not a guarantee that you'll get that. And I had many experiences where I did not get that. So it's playing with fire for
Yeah,
sure. But there is a
definitely.
lot of medicine in there too.
Well, I think it's, I guess what I would say, and this is something that I tackle a lot within my own work, is that we are so trained to, I mean, this is oversimplified, but kind of just think that we know everything and have this idea that we have kind of experienced the breadth of what there is to experience. And a lot of that also has to do with the fact that it's very difficult to imagine things that we have not experienced. But when you live in this kind of culture, in this society long enough, especially if you're not particularly like interested in spirituality, right? You're not interested in the mysteries. It can become very easy to think that the boundaries of your imagination really the horizons of your world are real,
Hmm.
that there
Right.
isn't anything beyond those horizons. And so I think, part of what going into the darkness is that you do have to take this part of your brain that's sitting there going, I know, I know, I know,
Yeah.
or if I don't know, I can imagine, or really it's this part of your brain that assumes that if you experience something new, it's going to be metaphysically or ontologically the same as everything you've ever experienced before. And you have to take that part of yourself and just shake it by the shoulders and be like, hey, you don't
Yeah.
know what you're talking about. And once you can disorient that, then you can maybe have a shot at sort of becoming oriented by a different principle, a different structuring. And in my podcast, one of the analogies that seems to hit hard for a lot of people is that I talk about moths and
Mm.
the moon, and this idea that moths need the moon in order to navigate. They use the light, they try to keep the light of the moon above them, so that they can fly straight through the darkness. But our society is a little bit like this world where somehow the moon has become obscured and the moths have forgotten the moon altogether. And with the loss of the moon, you also lose the logic of the sky or what
Right.
it means to navigate. And so you lose an entire dimension of the world. It's not just this one thing that's been lost, it's like how to orient yourself within the dark. And in such a world, I kind of talk about how these moths would just kind of crawl around on the ground, and maybe sort of fly towards a street lamp every once in a while. But they would have these entire parts of their bodies, their wings, that they're just like, I don't know why we have this. I don't know what this is for. I have an instinct, I have this yearning
Right.
toward maybe something I could use these wings for, but I don't know because I don't know what the moon is anymore. And so I think that, like, I just, for me, that analogy is how I would explain mystical experiences. And also, I use it to help people who are depressed understand that, like, yeah, the world looks really awful right now, but it's because you're missing uh, like a piece of the logic that is
Right.
required for you to make sense of the darkness.
Oof. Yeah, I feel that. I feel that loss of the sort of transcendent equivalent to the moon. And then there's this even like more pernicious aspect of it that I think we can relate to in terms of the modern human experience, which is that we're also like the moths who mistake the light bulb for the moon, and we
Exactly.
go toward the wrong things and think that those things are going to somehow orient us or feed us on the deep spiritual level, and they just confuse us. Again, I'm going to just rail on the fucking manifestation sort of based
Yes.
spirituality, like let me do my shadow work so that I can manifest type shit. um but so what is the human equivalent to the moon? And I know that in some sense that's like a forbidden question because it's like it's asking what is the highest orienting principle, and how can you even talk about the thing that's so transcendent that it's like what is somehow pulling us or pushing us or driving us or putting a sense of sacred yearning in us. But how do you think of it?
Whew, often I just default to the word ineffable because I think the ineffable is really sort of the gateway to heaven in the context of this, or the gateway to the moon, in the sense that once you can recognize the absolute reality of the ineffable, or that which cannot be put into words, then you start to get a sense of the whole. But for me personally, it's reality itself
Mm,
would be the moon. And I think that we have lost touch with reality, like what is actually around us and our experience of it. But that what I'm saying right now is not going to make sense to you if it doesn't make sense to you. You know what I
right.
mean? And I could be wrong, like I'm not that far into my own journey, but there are certain moments where I have seen something. It's interesting. I kind of almost want to return to Peter Kingsley here for a second because you mentioned that he seems to hold kind of like the mental experience as above material reality.
Yeah.
I, he might be doing that, you know, at some point you're not quite sure what he's saying. For me
Yeah.
though, what
Yeah.
he unearthed was um something like the meeting ground between the two, that like both were functionally and absolutely dependent upon each other, and that it was actually the act of experience that was the holy righteous thing at the center of the universe. And so for me, that's where I ground kind of my model. My understanding is that like reality would be one word that I could use for it, but experience, I think, real experience, like direct
Yeah.
apprehension,
Yeah.
that I think for me is the moon.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I'm sure coming from a different tradition, you could call the moon a million different things and it would still
Right.
be right.
Yeah. As you were talking, it occurred to me that I didn't ask you that question thinking I had an answer, but now there is something that
Yeah.
has popped into mind, and it really is the fact that no the deepest reaches that the human psyche and intellect is able to penetrate will always yield new sense and new mystery. And it
Yes.
presupposes that there is this deeper logic that runs throughout everything. And
Mhm.
this is demonstrated by Plato in the divided line analogy, which are essentially these like four different levels of knowing. The
Okay.
first two levels of knowing all take place in what they call like the realm of becoming, the the world of sights and sounds, as he calls it. And to him, it's not that that level of reality is not real, it's that it's less real than the two higher kinds of reality. So again,
Yeah.
you get into my confusion with Kingsley's problem with Plato a little bit here, because to me Plato is saying something very very similar, which is that when you start to get into the peak levels of human intellect and you start doing things like math and playing with the symbols of how the world is really logically presenting itself and truly exists in a way that you can demonstrate using these immortal symbol structures that we've discovered and that we call mathematics. But that
Mhm.
is not the highest kind of knowing. The highest kind of knowing is coming into what they call noesis, which is a direct experience with a form or with something that is beyond capturing in those symbols. So it's like you're
Mm.
starting to directly apprehend the source of logic, of sense, of all of these things. And you can experience it, but you can't, but it's in a map is not the territory kind of way. You can't return with the essence of that thing. Um, and I think in many ways that's like the moon for humans, is that there is this orienting force that you are made of and you are wrapped in and you are constantly swimming in, and like no matter where you look or how deep you go, it's always right there. Like the sensicality of reality is always right there. And if you really just sit
Yeah.
there and reflect on how wild it is that everything is always logical and everything is always there's nothing popping in and out of reality, even one whoopsie, it's never happening. Like the mouse,
Right.
I could drop the mouse on the table a billion times and it would never once just like slip right through the table. It's there's just this deep embedded logos in reality, and that in and of itself I think does drive the individual on their own individuation journey, because you
Mm.
slowly, in a kind of subjective way, you it's like what we were talking about before, when you're doing something as a means to an end versus intrinsically motivating, feeling like this really speaks to, it's like feeding something deeper within you. It's like watering your soul or feeding like whatever the soul thrives on, whatever the soul eats. And if you live your life in that way, I think you're acting in accordance with whatever that higher logic is in some way. And I think that's what Jung thought too. Like his whole circumambulation of the capital S self, it's like it really is much like orienting yourself toward the moon in that analogy, right? It's like you know it's there, you can sort of feel it pulling you, but you don't know which way to go. You're not quite sure. You're just using all of your faculties to try to get closer to whatever that thing is.
I mean, there's just the kind of final point that I would add to that, which is that I think by its very nature, this alternative ordering structure, whether it's the moon or if we think about sailors on the sea, it's like the
Hmm.
stars are being used to navigate. I think, and even the self, the capital S self, there's a sense that in order for it to do its job properly, it has to be something that we have no hope of reaching. And I could be wrong about
Hmm.
that, but it kind of goes back to my definition of meaning is that again, you have to have this something that exists on a metaphysically different plane almost that is
Right.
just as real, but it's behind almost like a veil. It's like hazy. And so the best that you can do is just almost like a magnet be guided by your
Yeah.
attempt to reach it. And I think it's in that friction somehow that you get like forward momentum and meaning and directionality. I think if you like collapsed into the heart of whatever this thing is, maybe that would just be like being dissolved back into the abyss. It actually makes me think a lot about the fact that, one of the most interesting aspects of Jung and um, Mysterium specifically is that there's this last part of the individuation process where the body is supposed to reunite with the world. And there's a lot of conjecture that that can never happen until death. Right?
Right.
And, I mean, even the question, was Jung individuated? Like, did
Hmm.
he reach
Hmm.
it? And I think part of everyone wants to say yes, because if he didn't, then how can we do that?
Right.
But I think that there has to be this sort of unreachable place. And maybe for Jung, it's death. Maybe for the individuation process, it could be death, but it could also just be the world, the task of reintegrating into the world. I mean, that's like collapsing the object and the subject. That sounds impossible, right? Like, except for maybe every once in a while in a ayahuasca retreat,
Right.
right? But
Yeah. Well, yeah. Now what you're bringing up is really reminding me of a few things. So one, I will say I have not read Mysterium yet. Two is what you're saying reminds me, and you almost like just got there yourself. It reminds me so much of Philemon's whole speech in the Red Book about how when the Principium Individuationis is first introduced, and he's like Philemon. So again, for people that don't know this, um, Philemon is like Jung's wise man archetype, but in this part of the Red Book, the Seven Sermons to the Dead um, part, it's presented as this Gnostic myth about how souls that do not achieve the Principium Individuationis dissolve back into the Pleroma, and ones that do become quote unquote distant stars. And
mm,
there's so much
yeah.
there's so much myth and philosophy behind that statement, but it's something that I've thought a lot about in terms of what he really meant by that. And I think what most people, what their first impression would be that this can absolutely not be literal, right? This can't, like, you don't literally become a distant star, right? However, the more Western esotericism you largely dunk your psyche into, the more you are continuously bumped up against these like astro-theological themes, right? Of you are in a relationship, like an as above so below type of relationship, where the microcosm of you is literally in some real ontological way a reflection of the macrocosm.
Mhm.
And again, this is why it's so strange to me to try to drive a wedge between Jung and Plato, because if you read the Timaeus, which is like the Platonic creation account, it makes that statement makes so much more sense, because they're talking about in this passage I'm thinking of from the Timaeus, when the creator, the demiurge, created human souls, each human soul got a counterpart star. So
Mm,
that right there brings some direct connection to this idea that in some strange way, your soul is literally entangled with a star, at least in this esoteric metaphysics. And there's this amazing Mary Louise von Franz quote about how it's literally something as insane as the totality of Jung's work is about waking up to the reality of your daimon and your fate, and like realizing that that's what you are and fulfilling that, and that's what real individuation is, and everything else is sort of just making it be more palatable to the modern Western mind or something like that. So you almost go through this whole crazy progression of maybe he's saying exactly what he meant in that really crazy
yeah.
esoteric Gnostic fable.
No, well, I mean, I think it's always beneficial to take Jung as literally as you can. And obviously, we don't want to do that. We want to be like, oh, he was talking metaphorically, symbolically. All he does is symbols. So shouldn't this be a symbol? And
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, I mean, you can entertain that. But one of my favorite parts of Catafalque specifically is that he talks about he kind of like does a little bit of an analysis into the section where Jung is talking to Philemon about magic. And
Hmm.
specifically, there's like a quote about, magic is precisely that which is like incomprehensible, that cannot be understood by the rational mind or understood at all. There is nothing to understand about magic. And when I first encountered that on my own, I was like, ugh, what does that mean? That's so crazy. And I was trying to
Right.
comprehend the incomprehensible. But if you look at it, it's a genius line because it's very literal. He's saying
Yeah.
that like magic is, in order for it to be magic, it has to be outside of our comprehension. And I think that, the addendum I might add to that is that if we could understand it, then it would be
Hmm.
technology. And
Right.
so he is basically saying that there is kind of this alternate world where comprehension is not, an aspect. And then if you bring the rational mind to that world, you've already lost it. You've
Right.
lost the way. And so I think there are certain moments with Jung where when I realized like, oh, he is gesturing toward a very experiential reality that is immediately like present for us. And what would the world have to look like for what he's saying in, X passage to actually make complete obvious sense? That is typically, I think, the best way to get what he is saying most of the time. And then every once in a while, yeah, you run up against something where he's not being quite literal and you turn your brain around in a million circles and you're like, okay, maybe he
Right.
was just maybe this one is an analogy, but um
Yeah.
I think it
Yeah.
is usually best approach.
Yeah. I mean, I think certainly with how well read he was and how careful he was with his words. Well, I guess you have to he's not always really careful with his words. Like this is
No.
part of the problem of reading Jung, is like, well, when he's saying self here, is he talking about the archetype, or is he just using it in the like colloquial normal sense of self, or was that was this an accident? That Have you read Bernardo Kastrup's Jung's Metaphysics?
Yes.
Um, yeah, he does a good job being like, okay, by like academic philosophical standards, you just don't try to put them on Jung, because he's not being careful with this terminology. He's writing from like a multitude of points of view, so you can't really do that. You have to kind of understand contextually how heavy to weigh each iteration. But I would say that when you're reading Seven Sermons to the Dead in particular, you do have to read that like it is a prophetic, revelatory text. And why would I say
Mhm.
that? Because he literally tried to publish it that way. Like he literally published it under a pseudonym
Yeah.
as like Basilides of Alexandria. And you would not do that unless you wanted people to read it as a a revelation, right? Um, so in some way, it's almost like he is specifically telling you to read this in in the sense of that anagoge we were talking about earlier of try to reach to the highest possible transcendent interpretation of what I'm saying while I'm saying this under um the context of that I'm publishing this as a pseudonym, as a prophet, basically.
Yeah.
um but then you wouldn't read everything he's put out under that same context, and that's one of the really tricky things about trying to understand what Jung meant and what he really believed. And I guess this is another potential cross with Kingsley, is like everything he wrote, you can't put on equal weight, you know? So you
Mhm.
have, I think it's like trying to take the totality of everything you can digest from him to really try to understand, well, was it more important for him to be a scientist or a mystic, or was he really trying to get across that he was both? You know, that's one of those things that I think is a very open question to me, and also maybe isn't that important, because it's sort of placing him on a pedestal either way. You know, pedestal of being this super important psychological theorist and scientist, or prophetic mystic, and maybe neither one of those things are that great or important on a personal level.
No, okay, I completely agree with that, and I think that, for me, the most interesting approach with regard to him, I mean, so first of all, terminology. I have spent so much time in my life trying to figure out what the fuck he means
Right,
by
right. Yeah.
certain words and just tracking it down. I have a copy of the index for the whole collected works, and just with like all these notes scribbled everywhere, like trying to find the original use of each term, blah blah blah. And he is very loose with his terminology. But at some point, once you experience that looping of just like, what do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean? Um, just to give an example here, shadow work or the shadow.
Hmm, hmm.
Um, there are times where he defines it pretty explicitly. There are times where he even says, like, oh, shadow work should be pretty easy. Like,
Hmm.
there is like some quote directly from him where he's just like, yeah, this part's pretty obvious for most people. It's the work with the anima that's like difficult. I was
Hmm.
like, what do you mean shadow work's easy? No, it's not.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And then there's another quote from him. I'm forgetting where this is from, but he is correcting one of his students and is just like, just stop talking about it. The shadow is the entirety of the unconscious.
Yeah.
And so you take those kind of three levels of analysis about this kind of word that we're also interested in. Like, I think anybody who's into Jungian psychology wants to know about their shadow. Um, but when you start to approach it from like, what relationship do you have to have with these concepts, with these experiences of your own psyche? Like, what could cause you to not really care about the terminology? What
Right.
what world could you be existing in for none of this to really matter, for all of this to just be like, it's whatever, it doesn't matter. It's the experience that matters.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that when you kind of try to, I mean, almost sometimes I feel like the best way to approach him is to sort of triangulate where he is with regard to each one of these concepts by taking all of the different ways that he describes them, all the ways that they clash, and just trying to sit and kind of intuitively understand, like, okay, where
Yeah.
is he coming from? And that's the best you're going to get,
I
probably.
agree. I
Yeah.
totally agree. Yeah, and I think there's this type of writing that he does, that Kingsley does, that a lot of these thinkers do, that I think is specifically almost meant to just immerse you in certain ideas so
Yes.
that you build the the fluency to use them as potential lenses, you know, rather
Yes.
than, and I guess Jung did this a lot. Like, I mean, to me at least, the things I've read over the years do not strike me as overly practical or straightforward or easy to actually exercise in your own life. But this is a place that I arrive to, I think, in a lot of these conversations that I'm happy to arrive at again, is that there really actually is a lot of power in slowly changing your worldview through osmosis of these ideas. Like the
Hmm.
more times you come into contact with them and the more familiar they become, not only is it like the more intellectual influence they have on your mind, the more they actually start to alter the way that you see reality. And that actually changes the subjective experience of existing it, like
Yes.
in a more soulful, meaningful direction. And
Hmm.
that in and of itself is gigantically important.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I said it earlier, but going back a little bit to some of the depression stuff that I do, I feel very strongly that if we are ever going to like actually tackle something like depression, we need to understand more about what it means to perceive. And in order to understand
Yeah.
what it means to be a perceiving individual, we have to understand our own subjectivity, and not just in a psychological sense, right? Like typically when we approach things like this, we're like, oh, what are you thinking about the issue? And what are you feeling about the issue? But we don't really
Yeah.
look at how is the world coming to appear to you. And for
Yeah.
me and my work, depression is all about how is the world coming to appear, and the work of perception, of changing what you are literally able to perceive, where your attention is going. That is something that has to be done at this very irrational level. In my work, I talk a lot about reference points, and these are sort of like these planets around which our entire perception like is sort of orbiting.
Mm.
And if you can change a reference point, typically a reference point would be something like a memory. In the case of a lot of depressed people, it might be something like a traumatic memory. But that is creating like the foundation for your own personal narrative, right? Or it's creating the horizons of your world. It's saying there's nothing beyond this experience. And so even just coming into contact with somebody like Jung, Peter Kingsley, all these kind of thinkers that I am in love with, um, it you do start to notice different things. And if you start to notice different things in the world around you, then you might have a shot at having a different reference
Yeah.
point that can then construct the world in an entirely different way. But you can't think your way into it.
No.
You kind of have to just move around it until it clicks.
Yes. Yeah. That makes me think of a specific Jung quote. I'm trying to remember. Maybe no, what I think I'm actually thinking of is like the subjective felt sense of clicking is something that's talked about in dream analysis. That's what it
Mm,
is.
mhm.
Is that when you're doing dream analysis and you're making initial associations with whatever the image is, and you're just kind of like throwing not things that you want it to be about, but you're just throwing things at the wall. One of the things Jung talks about is the importance of that subjective tickle of clicking of ooh,
Yes.
that elicited some kind of energetic something or other in me. And I was just on this note. I'll posit this to you because I was just thinking about it earlier. Sometimes to me, dream analysis feels more like a Trojan horse than actually being about the image. And this is something that's
Mm,
like would fly in the face of Hillman or like even a lot of Jung stuff, which is like where you're like trying to stay with the image and really explore the image itself. And what I mean by this is like it almost doesn't matter what the image is if you have a subjective feeling of something unconscious coming to the surface. Because if you're finding something out or you're connecting the dots on something or you're even having the feeling of why did that elicit an emotional response in me, and then that gets you to pull something out that you didn't previously know, you're still doing the Jungian adage of making the unconscious conscious, even if you're not getting to the bottom of whatever that specific image is. You know what I'm saying? It's like it
yeah.
almost seems like it's just almost anything can be a portal to get you there if you can like pull the rabbit out of the hat somehow.
No, I yes, absolutely. And it's kind of interesting because I have encountered a lot of Jungians who are very rigid in their understanding of dream interpretation.
Mm,
There are some like my mom is like very interested in Jung as well, and that's kind of
yeah.
how I got into him. And she's gone off on retreats or workshops with people who are like, no, there is one interpretation. That's it, done and done. And then she's done other retreats and other workshops where you have somebody who's doing dream interpretation that's not even particularly Jungian, more in the realm of shadow work.
Mm,
And the person who led that kind of style, would often just sit and intuitively wait to hear the dream. And then he would just come in with this jab, just like he would just say something, and the entire person's world would sort of fall apart because he was listening for this tiny little, um, I guess, weakness in the ego is sounds very
okay.
cult like, but and so there's what I'm getting at is that there can be a very intuitive approach, there can be a very subjective approach, or there can be a very objective approach, right? Where like every symbol has to mean exactly what it's supposed to mean. And I think my experience with it, or my interest in dream analysis at this point, is that when I look at my dreams, I try to think about like, how would I interpret this if I didn't know who Jung was? Or if I
Mm,
didn't know
mhm,
anything about any of these people, just what does this immediately kind of say to me? But then, of course, the first thing you're going to get back is ego feedback.
right.
Just that, so you are looking for kind of a somatic or like an intuitive response. And like you said, that tickle, I think, is really appropriate. And I don't know if that's the right way to do it or not. But what I do know is that I think it's time for us to internalize Jung's project,
Yeah,
and that is going to mean leaving him behind. And we can always go back to him if we're unsure what we're doing. You can always go back to like traditional approaches or how Jungians might approach it. But I think it's so much more interesting at this point to just venture out on your own into the
totally.
dreamscape.
Yeah,
So,
so well said. Yeah, that might be a good note to wrap this riff up on. But I guess the follow-up question is, and I'll let you have the closing thought on this, is I won't ask you to tell me what you think that means writ large, but what does that mean for you? What does it mean as someone who's like done a deeper dive into him than probably 99% of people? Um, what is evolving beyond that look like for you? Like what directions is that leading you in?
um, do you mean with regard to dream analysis or just Jung at large?
No, I mean in general. I mean, yeah, yeah. And just
You
like
know,
and really this whole project of like sense making and contextualizing, because I assume what you were saying applies to all of that, not just dreams, but maybe I'm reading too far into it.
no, it does. I mean, for me, it does apply to pretty much everything. I guess, like I said, I grew up with a very Jungian background. And
Yeah,
for a very long time, that just kind of was the way that I made sense of myself and my psyche and of others. And that could be very isolating at times because I was growing up in a very rural community where no one really shared that intuition, I guess, about like who we are, what our psyches are. It was largely just kind of religious people, frankly.
right.
And so I fought like tooth and nail for most of my life, even going to college, to defend Jung, to kind of say like, hey, there's something here, even in the context of academia, where people were kind of like, oh, you can't prove what he's saying, that's not empirically valid or whatever. And I was like, okay, well, but can't there be something more there? And finally I got out of college and was able to just like fully dive into his work. And I guess the point that I got to is that I say this in my podcast, but I think Jung was pointing toward a door, and that
Mhm.
door was entirely based on his own experience. And there's a book that I have that is a conversation with James Hillman where they talk about how, if you had to save one book from the entire, like, everything that Jung has ever written, the Red Book would be it. They kind of feel that you could throw away every single other book. And the thing about the Red Book that's really fascinating is that he never uses the word collective unconscious. He never talks about
Mhm.
archetypes. He never talks about the shadow. He uses a
Yeah.
completely different vocabulary. And so, my project, or what I'm interested in at this point, is to one, tap into the experiential world that he must have been in order to say the type of stuff that he says, which we talked about
Right.
earlier.
Right.
But also, I'm really adamant. I love talking about Jung, but as I approach these ideas, I want to be able to describe them in a vocabulary that doesn't utilize any of his terms, because I don't think that you really understand something until you can describe it a number of different ways.
Right.
And so in my approach, I'm kind of like, okay, when I'm doing inner work, I'm going to do it and I'm not going to think about it as like active imagination. I'm not going to think about it like dream work. I'm just going to see where my intuition takes me. And if I want to return to all that, great, I can do that. I have a lot of years to do that, you know?
For sure. Yeah, it really reminds me of, the cliche adage of like learn the rules then break them
Yes.
sort of thing. Because I do think intellectual understanding, steeping in these ideas, really doing the due diligence, I do think it's important. I don't think you can just skip over it. I like there's so much of that in me. Like I'm speaking from personal experience. Like I want to take shortcuts. I want to know like the gist of things. I want to do the minimal amount of work a lot of the time. And in a lot of senses, there's overdoing, but there's also not a shortcut. And I think when
No.
you learn to wield these lenses deftly and continue to remember that they are just lenses, like they are just maps, they are not the territory, then you become like a magician in a sense, right? Because you have all these different ways of finding your way through the ineffable that even though
Right.
they're not really whatever it is, they help you orient yourself in a responsible and medicinal way. And that's super important. I think that's exactly what you're doing, Sarah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Everybody, definitely check out her pod. Definitely check out her page. There will, of course, be links to all of those things. Um, is there anything else?
No, just thank you so much for having me on. This has been awesome. And my first video experience, which